At the start of your business journey, you are the everything. On your business journey, you are the everything in your business, and it can be a really lonely path. You are putting out the rubbish, you are making the coffee, you are the marketing manager, the sales director, the finance director, you name it. You are doing it all, and it can feel really overwhelming. Sometimes you find yourself searching for all those answers, which can be really, really tiresome. And then you can come across just the solution that you didn't know you needed, which isn't always helpful, but exactly why I created these bite-sized trainings, learnings, golden moments for you that will help you along this journey. So my name is Lindsay Burden, and I am an intuitive business coach, and I work with ambitious women in business, helping them find their solution to financial abundance and a time-rich lifestyle. But I don't want to talk about me today. I am beside myself with excitement today, Paul, because I get to talk to the incredible Paul Snell. So first of all, welcome. Before I introduce you, I just want to say welcome, and everyone will know in a moment why I'm so excited.
Morning, Lindsay.
So Paul Snell, owner of Kite Coaching. Now, I wrote some notes here. Okay, well, first of all, Paul works with business owners. We need to know that, don't we, Paul?
Yeah.
Showing them how they can take the stress out of transforming teams and turning them into performance powerhouses that love what they do. Now, Paul, you are coach, mentor, trainer, all-round great person and co-host of the podcast Challenging the Norm, which I get to co-host with you. So, talking today won't be any problem at all, I am sure. But I just wanted to touch on something before we get started. And I always ask my guests to give me a title for the recording. And you've chosen Managing Conflict in the Workplace with Emotional Intelligence. But I wanted to go back to that powerhouses. It's such a fabulous word, and that's what everyone needs. So perhaps at the start of their journey, they might not have a team, but as we grow our businesses, I know from experience, my clients who have staff and teams, I spend a lot of time talking about them.
Yeah, the thing for me is this. I really do believe people make or break a business. Yeah. It's that simple. And when you reach a point, and we usually all start out as solopreneurs. We got a great idea. We want to change the world, and we can help people to do that. At some point, with all that amazing success, we start to bring people on board. And things change because as you quite rightly pointed out in your introduction, we wear all the hats, right? When we're on our own, we wear all the hats. And all of a sudden we need to hand out these hats to people. What's that all about? Where does that come from? What do you mean I'm not in charge of marketing anymore?
Yeah.
And so in doing that, we realize we then need to trust. We then need to be able to hand over, not just delegate a task, but delegate a responsibility. And that's the big shift. All of a sudden, we're freed up to focus on the business and leading the business and taking it to the places we want to take it with the people that are on that journey with us. And so for me, the idea of a powerhouse team is a bit like the engine in a fast car. You can drive as much as you like, but if there's no engine in there, you don't go anywhere. And it's the same thing.
And if you're not looking after that engine,
yeah,
you're going to get problems, aren't you?
There you go.
So I'm just wondering, Paul, and this isn't on any notes that I've made at all, but I'm just thinking that early journey as you start, what are the key things that we really have to think about to ensure that we have powerhouses and actually to try and avoid some of the problems that can come up when we have even a small team, but particularly when we go to that whole departments?
I think there's a few things here. I think the first thing is start as you mean to carry on. There's a great deal of excitement when you think about, I need people now. Things are growing that well. It's great, right? And then there's a risk, and the risk is you simply employ on the back of a need, rather than employ on the back of a need and how that need will fit in with the culture that you're trying to build. So we look for the best qualified or the most cost effective, whatever words you want to use. And then we start to put people together. And there's always that risk that things aren't going to pan out well, that, you know, these people don't know each other. But it's up to you to build the culture that you're looking for. You know, I see this a lot, a huge amount. In fact, right now, so many times where I'm seeing more and more small business owners prepared to sit down and decide, and it takes time. You sit down and work this through, what it's going to look like to work for your company, what it means, where your company is going to go. So the big shift for me, I guess, in the last 10 or 15 years has been people realizing that they really do need to have a plan about culture, not just about function.
You said something really interesting then, because I know from the clients that I do work with, is that, okay, we know that there is this need here, and you know what, and you immediately go down the job description, job specification, and think about, but it can be really, what's the word I'm looking for? It can happen without realizing that you don't think about the bigger picture, and actually could say, well, this is the need today, but actually, where is the business going? And I think that probably happens a lot, where we get stuck in that I need somebody now, and lose sight of the bigger picture and the direction and where it's going. And maybe that's where some of the issues come along, because you employ for now the need today rather than thinking into the future.
Yeah, it's a tough one, that, Lindsay, because there's only so far we can see with any great tangible reality to it. You know, we can all sit and go, well, in 5 years' time, this is how it's going to look. And fabulous, right? We start with the end in mind. However, the journey to that can be different. What I will tell you is it won't go the way you think it's going to go. That's usually the case. So your adaptability will always be tested. But I think you have to start with what you would like to see as key to working in your business. And let me give you a really small example. There's a company I know that one of their values in bringing people on board is they need the tools to do their job well. So if you turn up, or when you turn up on your first day, what's on your desk is a brand spanking new laptop, is a mother, and these are, I was going to say these are insignificant things. Nothing's insignificant, but things like there is a water bottle there, there is a big monitor there, there's all the things you need from day one to be effective. And that makes them feel part of it. Immediately, there's this feeling of, oh, I'm part of something here because they've invested in me. And I think that's a crucial part. Up front, early days, is demonstrate to people that they are important to you and your business. Because the old adage that you're only a leader when you have followers, you need to give people the opportunity to recognize this is a great place to be, this is a great place to work, and you're the right person to lead it.
I love that, because I know I've started many a job where the email address isn't ready. I don't know what my telephone number is. They're not even sure where they're going to sit you. They think you're going to go over here, but today you'll just sit over here. Yeah, what a wonderful way to be welcomed in. And that's part of that really important word that you mentioned, which is culture.
Yeah. Yeah, it's for me, it's the place to start, right? But recognize that will evolve. There is no with all best plans and all of that sort of stuff, it will evolve. There will be times where you're challenged. There will be times when you realize that actually the decision you made wasn't the right one. That's all okay, right? One of the key elements, I think, of an effective leader is vulnerability. And I don't mean, oh, I'm going to tell everyone about my personal problems. That's different game. What I do think it's about is being able to say, look, we're in this together. There is no, you know, I'm not sitting here as a CEO of a business that's got, you know, several hundred people in it. I'm actually sitting here working through the idea of leadership as best I can with people around me and letting them know that this is something you'll grow together in. Because believe it or not, people respond well to that, right? It's when you say, no, I know it all. And then we end up in disasters and we end up in places we don't want to be. And people go, well, clearly you didn't. What's going on here? So this idea of vulnerability, not the one that goes, I want to tell you about my sordid details, but the vulnerability that talks about, as a leader, I'm only human. But what I do care is about you, and I do care about this business, and I want this to work, and I want your input into that. You get proper evolved buy-in when you engage people at that level.
Yeah, it's the buy-in, isn't it? It's helping them to see that they're part of the journey and they're an important part and they have a role and responsibility within this journey.
Yeah.
I always ask my guests for 3 shares or key points. And we're going to have to come to your 3 because number 2 is the one I really need to get to. But the first one you wrote down here was know your conflict style.
Yeah.
What did you mean by that?
And I picked the topic of conflict because more often than not, that's hidden in a corner, right? We don't want conflict. We don't do conflict. And the reality is we actually do. We just don't know we do until we do, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And conflict is an interesting one because invariably it's an instant emotional response that kicks in, right? So if we have 2 bits of the brain, we have the prefrontal cortex where the logic sits and the processing sits, but we have this really strange little bit of the brain called the amygdala where all the emotions, memories, the instinctive stuff that we do, the habits, they all sit there. And the minute we feel that we're going into conflict, the amygdala takes over everything. I mean, and in fact, there's a fantastic way of looking at it called amygdala hijacking. All of a sudden, it takes over the whole bit of the brain, and your feelings are dominant. Yeah. They become the thing. And in conflict, feelings are really, really challenging at times. And that's the reason, we call this thing emotional intelligence. It's not about not feeling. It's about recognizing what you're feeling. So when I talk about conflict and the emotional management of conflict, it's because it's about observing a feeling for what and seeing it for what it is. And your conflict style is one of those things. If you can observe how you tend to respond in a conflict situation, you can begin to see how you do that. And let me give you an example. I know many people that their response to conflict is sarcasm. It's much easier just to go, well, if you're going to attack me, I'm going to get all sarcastic with you. And that just descends into chaos very, very, very quickly. But the reality is, if you can observe that in yourself, there's a bit of self-awareness here. Yes. And there's a lovely description by an author called Priya Parker, and she calls it being a heat-seeking missile. And what that means is heat. She talks about heat in conflict. And what she's saying is, invariably there's heat. Right, as a conflict kicks off, you feel the heat. And she says, what you got to be careful of with heat is it spreads. So if you're in a conflict or a conflict situation, what can happen is this. If you imagine an argument, it doesn't have to be at work, but it can be anywhere. Yeah. We say, right, we're going to kick off with the subject that's causing the conflict. Right. And what we do with this heat is go, oh, and by the way, also this and also that. And did you realize you do this as well? That's where the heat starts to really spread out. So to observe your conflict style is to sit and go, how do I respond to conflict? What is my instinctive response? Do I go into sarcasm? Do I go into dominate the conversation so there's no room for discussion? And when you can observe your conflict style, you can begin to manage that more effectively. Now, you have to remember that the emotional part of the brain does take over. So it takes a discipline and it takes practice to recognize how you may respond in a conflict situation. And your conflict style is key. Now, when I talk about conflict style, it isn't necessarily a positive thing. More often than not, your conflict style is something you need to temper or you need to manage, because when you begin to recognize if sarcasm is your conflict style, then you can go, do you know what? I'm not playing that game. But you need to do that in advance. If you're going into a conflict situation, if you're I don't know, you have challenges with a team member at work, or you have challenges with an employee, or whatever it might be, you often know in advance you're going to enter into conflict, conversation, or whatever it might be. and understanding, being self-aware of your conflict style can really change how you approach it, whether that goes from being sarcastic to listening, to being willing to listen, or another great tip for conflict is acknowledge you have common views on something, right? If there is a conflict over how you're leading a team, between a team member and a manager, recognize that you both have the common interest for the company. That's what you're about. When you articulate common ground, it really diffuses the feelings of conflict, because your emotional brain goes, oh, we have some common interests here. He can't be all that bad. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, it changes it completely. And that understanding and recognizing and acknowledging your conflict style also enables you to prepare better for when there is conflict. And like if you're saying going and having a meeting with somebody, you know there's going to be conflict, it's about preparing yourself and being able to deal with it better.
Yeah.
So that's a really, really great tip, understanding and knowing your conflict style and acknowledging it. So if it's all right with you, we'll move to number 4. I have no idea where this is going. Okay, the 4 horsemen of an argument.
Yes, this is a concept.
Well, I was hoping horses weren't going to come, through the office or anything, and everyone jump on them and go for it.
It's not pestilence, death, and whatever else these 4 horsemen do. I was worried. The concept, it comes from a psychologist called John Gottman, and he did loads of research into conflict, and he identified 4 things that are often integral to a poor conflict situation. First thing he talks about is criticism. He says that's one of the keys. So when you're having a conversation or it's challenging, criticism's a problem. Contempt is another one, right? Defensiveness, stonewalling. What we mean by that is, in defensiveness, it's like, well, it's not my fault. It's blameless, right? It's never my fault. If we talk about stonewalling, it's refusing to address the issue at hand, right? No, I'm going to walk away from that. And there are different, these things happen in different ways to different people, right? But the criticism part for me is a big one. It's the most common that I come across out of these 4 different elements of style, if you like. Contempt being the one where you're just constant blame, right? You're beneath me, that type of wording. But criticism's a key one. This is an important one. And what I mean by that is this: more often than not, when someone criticizes, they criticize someone's personality or character. So what that means is this: it's a bit like saying, Lindsay, you're always late. You're not, by the way, just so we're clear. You're always late. And what that does is define you, right? And it gives you no room for maneuver. So if I criticize you, I judge your character in that way. And if I judge your character, you have nowhere to go. You're labeled at that. So between you and I, in our relationship, all of a sudden, I've labeled you as something, not just what you do, but who you are. Yeah. And that's really hard to get away from that point on. And you feel that labeling, right? It becomes a huge issue for you. Whereas, to be fair, and criticism really isn't the word here that we apply a better way of doing this. It's more to do with feedback. And the idea is not feedback in the contents, let me tell you a positive about you. It's about an approach to judging, right? I'd love to say no one judges, but we all do. Yeah. And that's the reality to it. But here's the thing. If we judge an action over someone's character, they have the opportunity to change. Yes. So if I say to you, Lindsay, why did you lie? I've judged an action you took, and you have the opportunity to go, well, Paul, I was concerned about this, or I'm really sorry, whatever it might be. You come back addressing that action, but you don't feel labeled by it. Yeah. So when we talk about these 4 horsemen of conflict, which I do find a bit funny as a description, in the criticism part, I want people to understand that if you're going to make a judgment or criticize, don't do that that labels somebody's character. At best, do that to address an action, because that's something people can change.
I'm just wondering if this comes back to culture again, because it's about and being nobody likes to be criticized. You know, as business owners, we ask for feedback. We don't really want feedback unless it's really, really good, because actually that's quite scary. But it's that culture, isn't it? It's about creating a culture where you are able to have honest conversations to move things forward, to make things better, to enable that employee, that staff member, to be the best that they can possibly be, because ultimately that's what you want, because you want powerhouses.
Yeah, and these four things are really designed, or they're not designed. Design would be a wrong word. They are explained in a way that's similar to understanding your conflict style. And that is, if you feel or see any of these four appear in your approach to conflict, you need to take a break and stop. In almost all cases, when it comes to conflict and the escalation and the heat, the still the most effective way is to recognize the behavior and then stop. Take a break, 10 minutes, whatever it might be, and then readdress. But it's being all of this, Lindsay, is self-awareness. All of this comes from understanding who you are and how you tend to behave. It's incredibly difficult. The description is the time it takes for the feeling of criticism and your amygdala to take over is like milliseconds. You can't stop that. There is no, okay, let me stop for a second here and stop that hijack. You can't. It's going to happen. What you do is preparation. You mentioned it earlier. It's all about the preparation. Recognize how you tend to behave. Recognize the specifics of that behavior. Do you criticize? Do you get defensive? Do you stonewall? Do you start being contemptuous to someone? If you can recognize any of these four traits in conflict, you can begin the process of preparing in a way that diffuses rather than creates this heat.
I'm glad you mentioned that those conflict styles, because as you were talking about the different horsemen, and in my head they really are on a horse. I was thinking they are conflict styles, aren't they?
Yeah, they are.
What you're talking about there is exactly what we can all recognize in ourselves. If we just sit for a moment, we know that we have stonewalled, or it's not my fault, and all of that. We know that we have done that. So that's a really good second piece, and builds on that conflict style and helps people, I think, to understand what their conflict style is. The third thing you've put down here, and we've kind of alluded to this in various different ways, conflict is a dialogue, which I think is a really powerful statement that you added here.
Yeah, it's ultimately, with all of these elements of self-awareness and conflict, it does come down to the style of dialogue. And it takes practice. Yeah. There is no practice makes perfect. You are not going to have perfection here. But what you are going to have is an opportunity to adapt your dialogue style. What do I mean by that? It is often the case of things like, let's listen more than we speak, even in conflict. And there's a huge tip here. Be prepared to let the silence happen. All too often, we try and fill the gap, particularly when it's an emotional context. We try and fill the gap with some noise, because that's the only way you're going to detract from that uncomfortable feeling of conflict. But sometimes you just need silence. Sometimes you need to allow things just to happen, and don't be uncomfortable with that silence. There are things to be said, and it should be okay to say them. And the only time, as I talk about this heat, the only time that heat really starts to have impact is when you try and be better than the last comment. When you try and be more critical, more contemptuous, more defensive. So when we talk about dialogue, keep that dialogue very level, and practice that, not allowing the heat to become that missile. Practice those, identify those four behaviors, those four conflict styles, because your dialogue then will diffuse. And remember, one of the best approaches to having a conflict conversation at the very start of that, acknowledge where the common ground is.
Yeah.
Right? Don't go into it, well, you said this, and this is that situation. I'm really unhappy with this. Start with the acknowledgement that, you know, in almost all cases, there is common ground to be had. And for example, between a team player, a part of a team, and a manager, is the common ground is we want the best for the company, for the people. So this is something, let's talk this through rather than jump straight in with that emotionally hijacked element of your brain and just dump everything you can to make you feel better. And now that the outcome is not necessarily to make you feel better, it's to resolve a conflict, a difference between what you feel and believe and the other person.
You've hit the nail in the head, really. Really? Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. It's resolution. That's what you're looking for, isn't it? The resolution, and so you can move forward from it. The other thing that came to me actually is when we can get comfortable with the silence, it actually just gives you that moment to think before you speak.
Oh, yes.
And that is on both sides. And that's so key, isn't it? Just giving yourself a moment, because it's really easy to just vent, and we can back ourselves into a corner.
Yeah.
And then where do you go from it? So actually just and maybe that's part of, if you were having a meeting, setting it out and saying, you know, we might have moments of silence, and that's okay. We're just going to both, you know, it's setting out the ground rules. I mean, of course, we're talking generally here, and it depends what's going on, but actually setting out the ground rules for any meeting conversation will really help. And that goes back down to that preparation, doesn't it?
It does. And I can also remember years ago that I had a mentor who would help me understand training, group training. And one of the things he always did was whenever he got in the room and he was preparing, he would pin a sign on the door. And it simply said, any criticism doesn't come through this door. And it's that simple. You know, he made a point. He said, no criticism, no condemnation. You come in here open for understanding and learning. And it really worked. It's such a powerful thing to do, because people come in with predefined view on what's going to go on. And yet when you set the ground rules, as you quite rightly put, you do that from a place of non-conflict. It's simply exchanging a bit of information. Right. And so by setting those ground rules, in those ground rules, defining where the common ground is, why we're here, right? We're doing this training. I've done this, and you will have done this, Lindsay. In a room of 20 people, there's always one or two that go, I don't really want to be here. And they let you know, right? But by having these ground rules, you can simply say, well, you know, you may not want to be here, but here we are. And let's make the best of that. And here's some things we're going to run with. And that is, we're not going to get critical, and we're not going to make it personal.
Yeah.
And the ground rules thing is key. And the same with preparation. Any situation, really work on your preparation, not just the facts, but how you feel and how they may feel going into this conversation. It's pretty transformational, but it does take perseverance.
Yeah. I think the other message really is that it's okay, because what might work now in year 1 or year 2 may not work when you have a larger team, a larger business, different responsibilities, higher stress levels will be different. And I think also for me, it's about recognizing that sometimes we're all going to feel different on a different day. So, you know, you could have done the prep work and you're going in and you think you're going to have a really difficult conversation. And actually the person was just really having a bad day. Today they feel great. And they're like, oh yeah, I'm sorry, this happened, that, you know. And I wonder if that's around preconceived ideas. And I had another question for you as well, Paul, because I wondered where you stood on it, because I know certainly from having conversations with my children, for instance, in my head, I'm going, okay, so if they say that and they want to do that, you're already coming up and your brain's working so hard to think about every single possible outcome and scenario. And I'm just wondering how helpful that actually is. I know it's not from a personal level at all, because I'm never going to get it right or guess correctly. But how do you think from a business perspective, how useful that is? I mean, it's important to know what your outcome needs to be.
Yes. So I don't think it's very useful at all. It's the difference between subjectivity and objectivity, right? If we try to go down those rabbit warrens of, but if he says that or she says that, and then we need to go there, and you will, you'll never get achieve completely covering everything, and B, you won't remember it.
No.
So it's a waste of what I like to call brain calories. It's just way too much effort. Whereas if you stick to objectivity, which is all about style. So what we've spoken about today is style, right?
Yeah.
What style is my conflict? What is my conflict style? What are these four horsemen all about? Because they're not subjective, right? Criticism is very objective, as is all four of them. So what you can do, and I guess the easiest way to describe it is build a conflict framework. So what you end up doing is going, right, going into any situation where there may be a risk of conflict, I am aware of all the possible styles, or I'm aware of what that might mean. And I'm also aware of how I tend to respond. So what are the triggers in me? What is the heat potential in me? So that I'm in a good place to go into this. And also, I've not tried to figure out where they may go or what they may do, because by definition, it tends to be fairly irrational at some point. They can go into it with thinking, right, I am going to pick him up on the number of hours I have to work out of office hours, whatever it might be. They go into it with a very clear point to make. But when that hijacking occurs and the heat kicks in, oh, it'll go off on other tangents. I can tell you 100% it will go in places you were not expecting. But as long as you've prepared on how you manage that, that's the only thing you can control, isn't it? Let's be honest. You can't control how they're going to behave or what they're going to come with, but you can control how you behave. And that's what this is about, really.
I just wanted to sort of spin back almost to the beginning of our conversation. And certainly when I do this introduction, I talk about the start of our journey and where we are in our journey. When business owners are starting to build that team, there's appraisal systems and there's 360s and there's everything and anything that you could possibly do. Where do you think people should start? Is it about building in a system that works for now with a view that you are always going to review it so that it can build alongside of you? Because quite often I know business owners, certainly with a smaller team, and they go, yeah, we have an appraisal system. We don't do it particularly regularly. And it just falls up. And in part, that's because they're really small teams and they're like family. So what's your sort of top tip, I guess, for starting in the right way, for setting the foundations for a really good system that works to keep your staff to a place where actually there's less likely to be conflict, maybe?
Keep it simple.
Yeah.
It's really that straightforward. There is so much information out there about how to build great teams and how to build a great culture. The problem is it's often this cookie cutter approach that goes, here's the 10 things you need to do to have a great culture. But you find that only 3 of them actually mean anything to you for your situation with your business. So my suggestion is always keep it simple. Don't over-engineer it, because what we know for sure is it will need to evolve.
Yeah.
There is no perfect situation that you'll carry on with and great, that's it for the next 20 years, you're sorted. That's not how this works. It will need evolving. It will need growing. It will need changing. It will need to adapt. But if you over-engineer something, all you're doing is creating a lot of work up front and then realizing that, oh my goodness, I've got to unpick this now. Whereas if you stick with clarity, and be very clear with your team, however small they are up front, what are your values? What do you stand for? What do you expect from the people that work for you? So there is no confusion. There is no assumptions. It's all about understanding and awareness. But don't make it any more complicated than that. Keep it simple. Keep it straightforward. Understand it's going to change. And make sure values is part of that, so people know where they stand.
I had to ask you that, and I'm so glad you mentioned the word cookie cutter, because if anyone listens to our podcast, we do not like cookie cutters, blueprints, formulas. You can tie yourself up in knots with that kind of thing. So it's really making it simple. And I would imagine that if you've never created any form of appraisal system or way of working, that you reach out and get that help so that you have someone alongside of you to do it. So you're not making it up and doing it by the seat of your pants, because that could actually create conflict, which is the exact thing that you do not want to happen in your team.
Correct.
Well, we've covered off those 3 points. I love talking to you. As you know, I could talk to you all day, and some days we just do. But one of the questions I ask everyone that I interview is, if you started your business again, what would you do differently? Or, you know, what would you take forward? And you actually wrote, build a network of peers way quicker.
Yeah, it's hindsight's 2020 vision, isn't it?
It's a great thing.
If only we had that as foresight. I think, I mean, you mentioned this in the introduction to this recording about how lonely it can be.
Yeah.
And we go into business excited, energetic, focused, and there's always a dip. It's usually about 3 months in. There's a dip, and that dip is for various reasons. It can be, I'm not making the progress I wanted to make. The sales are not coming in. Did I really, really want to do this? And the best way to navigate these dips and the challenges on your journey is to have people around you that you trust, people that will support you, people that will encourage you, right? One of the big things when you first start out in business is you're always going to have the naysayers, the ones that go, oh, you're mad. What do you mean you're giving up a full-time income? You always have those. To balance that out, have those that go, do you know what? I've been there and I've done that and I'm here now. Let me tell you, it's an amazing adventure where you make choices. And so have those people around you. Sometimes they'll be friends. Sometimes they'll be business associates. Sometimes there will be colleagues. Whatever it is, have people around you, because that mitigates this loneliness. And actually, if you choose well, there's some really good benefit to those relationships.
Yeah, and if you've got nowhere to start, I always say start with networking, because there are some incredible networking groups, and you will absolutely find your people. And in the right networking group, they want you to be successful.
Oh, yes.
All that they can to help you.
Yeah.
And yeah, if your loved one tells you it's a crazy idea, unless they're in business, they probably don't really know, and they're just trying to keep you safe.
That's right. I mean, that's important to acknowledge. Anytime you have these naysayers, they're not doing it, or very rarely, they're not doing it because they want you to fail. They're doing it because they love you enough to go, this is risky. And of course, business is, let's be honest, you know, there is risks involved in going into business, but as much as the enjoyment, and recognize that they do it to care. But what's really important is that you have that balance in place, because there will be people who turn around and go, I've been there. As I say, I've been there. I've done it. I'm here now. It's an amazing journey of challenges, lifting up, and all of that. It is worth doing. And so you get a balanced view. That's really what I think is important when it comes to having people around you.
That's a wonderful way to finish off. And I always turn everything off so nothing bings. And obviously I haven't turned my calendar off, and it's just come up that I'm recording a podcast episode with you in a minute. So we are going to have a full-on day of just talking to one another. Paul, you've really covered that, managing conflict in the workplace, and in so many ways. And as always, it's the reason I love spending time with you. You always bring it back to simple. You always provide such value to people, and it doesn't matter where you are on your journey, that you know you can start thinking about values and culture and what's important to you and how you manage conflict. Because even if you don't have staff, you are most likely, if you are in business, going to come up against some conflict. So wherever anyone is in their journey, you've shared today some really incredible tips. Now, if anyone does have a team, starting to think about a team, is way down the line and thinking, oh my goodness, I'd like a powerhouse, or I'd like to turn this great team into a powerhouse, where should they look to find you and connect with you?
Well, you've got 2 choices of contacting me. One is on LinkedIn. You can find me on there. It's not too difficult. There are not many Paul Snells. And the second one, you can pop on my website. I'll give you more information and a way of contacting me, which is paulksnell.com. both of those. And I would love to chat, even if it's just, let me give you some feedback, Paul. Always open for chatting.
We like a bit of feedback. And of course, if anyone would like to hear more from Paul, you can find Challenging the Norm on Spotify and Apple.
You can indeed.
Please do go and have a listen, where we have lots of fun and talk about those topics, buzzwords and trends, and try and sort them out for you all. Paul, it has been an absolute pleasure, as I knew it would be. Thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure, Lindsay.